Picture opening your eyes one morning and realizing that every hardship you've ever faced, every illness, every foggy thought, every moment of agony leads back to a single, horrifying truth, a truth you had no control over. You notice your shaky hands, your labored breaths, your muddled mind, and all of it points to choices made long before your first heartbeat. Your parents, consumed by the desire to keep their blood pure, have unknowingly doomed you to a lifetime of misery. You learn that your mother is also your cousin, your father is your uncle, and your grandmother doubles as your great-aunt. The family tree doesn't grow upward, it twists back on itself like a strangling vine. You are not the product of passion, but the outcome of a cold, calculated plan to safeguard power and fortune, regardless of the human toll. This isn't a Gothic tale. It's the lived reality of countless women across history, ensnared in genetic traps they never chose. Before we journey into these overlooked stories of pain and endurance, if you enjoy uncovering history's hidden corners, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I love that we're unraveling these ancient truths together from every corner of the world, linked across time by our shared fascination. To grasp their suffering, we first need to examine the warped reasoning that created it. For centuries, Europe's royal families believed that marrying within their own blood would safeguard their divine right to rule. They considered their blood literally different, holier, nobler, blessed by God. By the 1500s, their obsession turned Europe's monarchies into one vast, tangled network. Cousins wedding cousins, uncles marrying nieces, siblings producing heirs destined to wear crowns. What they failed to grasp was that they were engineering a hereditary catastrophe that would echo through time. No dynasty embodied this better than the Habsburgs of Austria and Spain, masters of dynastic self-destruction. Their unspoken motto could have been, "Let others fight wars, you, Austria, marry." But these were not romantic unions. They were cold, genetic calculations that birthed some of history's most tragic lives. Our journey begins in Vienna, 1634. Within the dim halls of the Hofburg Palace, a child is born who will never experience a single day free from pain. Maria Anna of Austria enters the world burdened by the Habsburg legacy. The result of generations of cousin marriages, her lineage twisted into something more like a noose than a tree. Maria Anna is painfully aware that she isn't like the other children. While they race through the palace gardens, she struggles simply to stay upright. Her spine bends at an unnatural angle, forcing her into a permanent hunch that makes each breath a chore. Her lower jaw juts forward so dramatically that chewing is almost impossible. Servants must slice her food into tiny fragments, and even then, every meal turns into a slow, exhausting ritual of cautious bites and careful swallows. Yet these physical hardships are nothing compared to the crushing weight of understanding why she endures them. She grows up surrounded by the solemn faces of her ancestors hanging on the palace walls, portraits that feel like mirrors. In one, an uncle with the same jutting jaw. In another, a grandmother with the same twisted spine. With a clarity that only suffering can bring, Maria Anna realizes she's not a medical anomaly. She's simply the newest casualty in a lineage built on genetic disaster. The royal physicians, with their endless bloodletting and murmured prayers, offer no true remedy. Behind closed doors, they quietly refer to the Habsburg curse, but never in her presence. To her face, they hide behind vague phrases. Mysterious ailments, God's will, never daring to admit the truth that everyone understands but refuses to speak aloud. Her pain is the direct legacy of her family's relentless inbreeding. Her days pass in shadowed rooms, the curtains drawn to conceal her from prying eyes and to shield her from the world that would surely judge her. In that dim isolation, she devours books. Her mind, one of the few parts of her body left untouched, becomes her escape. In those pages, she finds imagined worlds where love, not lineage, determines unions, where children aren't born carrying ancestral sins etched into their bones. But reality always forces its way back in. Court doctors examine her frequently, their hands cold and clinical. They record the bend of her spine, the jut of her jaw, the frailty of her limbs. She ceases to be a girl and becomes a specimen, a walking lesson in the consequences of royal obsession. Perhaps worse than the pain is the solitude. Potential husbands, nearly all cousins, recoil the moment they see her. Marriage negotiations spark briefly and die just as fast once her condition is revealed. She never marries, not out of personal choice, but because fate and circumstance make it impossible. Even in a society where cousin unions are commonplace, her deformities are too pronounced to ignore. Maria Anna's life ends early at just 32 as her body finally succumbs to the cumulative toll of inherited damage. Her death certificate lists a string of vague illnesses, but the true cause is left unwritten. She died because generations before her valued power more than people, purity more than mercy. From Austria, the tale shifts to Spain, where we meet perhaps the most tragic figure in this lineage of suffering, Joanna of Castile. History remembers her as Juana la Loca, or Joanna the Mad. Born in 1479 to Isabella and Ferdinand, the same Catholic monarchs who expelled Jews and Muslims from Spain and financed Columbus's expeditions, Joanna entered the world marked for greatness. Instead, she became a haunting lesson in the cost of royal inbreeding. Joanna showed no signs of instability in childhood. She was intelligent, well-educated, and fluent in several languages, but the seeds of her downfall were already buried deep within her DNA. Her parents were cousins, branches on the same tangled family vine of Europe's monarchies. The first cracks appeared after her political marriage to Philip the Handsome of Burgundy. What was meant to unite empires became a battlefield of the heart and mind. Philip was unfaithful, distant, and calculating. Joanna's reaction was an overwhelming, consuming love that others labeled as insanity. But was it truly madness, or simply the desperate response of a woman trapped by duty in an unloving marriage? Joanna had been raised to believe her worth lay in matrimony and motherhood, that bearing heirs was her divine role. When her marriage devolved into betrayal and pain, her psyche buckled under the strain. The true tragedy struck in 1506 when Philip died unexpectedly. Joanna's grief deepened into obsession. She refused to bury him, journeying across Spain with his coffin, opening it repeatedly to kiss his decaying remains. It's a chilling image, but it reveals something profound. She had been so starved of genuine love and human connection that even death couldn't sever her bond with the one man who, despite his cruelty, had been the center of her world. Her father Ferdinand, and later her son Charles V, seized on her madness as a political tool. They declared her unfit to rule and locked her away, using her vulnerability as justification to control the throne. For 46 long years, Joanna remained locked away inside the royal convent of Santa Clara in Tordesillas. Her living conditions were appalling. She spent her days in damp, unlit chambers, barely fed, denied even basic hygiene. Witnesses recorded that she could go weeks without bathing, that she shredded her own garments to pieces, that her screams would echo through the convent for hours on end. But this raises the crucial question: was Joanna truly insane, or was she driven to madness by what was done to her? Modern historians increasingly argue the latter. Her so-called madness seems less like a medical condition and more like a political strategy, a convenient justification to sideline a legitimate queen. Her behavior, while extreme, fits the pattern of someone enduring profound depression, crippling anxiety, and post-traumatic stress, all intensified by decades of forced isolation and neglect. The genetic factor, however, cannot be dismissed. Joanna's lineage is riddled with signs of hereditary mental health struggles, depression, anxiety, and instability that worsened through generations of inbreeding. Her great-grandmother experienced similar episodes. Her daughter Catherine would later battle severe depression. The pattern was visible to anyone willing to look. In 1555, Joanna died, still confined, still branded mad. Her passing attracted little attention. In truth, she had been erased from public life decades before, reduced to a cautionary footnote rather than remembered as a woman crushed by a dynasty that valued political expediency over human dignity. Our story now moves to the opulent Spanish court, where another tragedy begins. In the Golden Halls, a fragile girl named Margaret Theresa carries the weight of an empire. Born in 1651 to King Philip V of Spain and his niece Mariana of Austria, yes, his niece, she entered a world where uncles marrying their brothers' daughters had become entirely routine. Margaret Theresa's childhood is immortalized in extraordinary detail through the paintings of Diego Velázquez, the royal court painter. In his masterpieces, we don't see a carefree child, we see a little girl encased in layers of ceremonial fabric, posing stiffly in elaborate gowns. Her youthful face already bears subtle but unmistakable traces of the Habsburg legacy. Look closely. Her jaw pushes forward slightly, hinting at the more serious deformities that would surface as she grew. Her gaze is distant, unfocused, suggesting cognitive delays. Even her stance betrays early spinal problems, hallmarks of her lineage's genetic decay. But Margaret Theresa's greatest tragedy isn't her physical fragility. It's her total lack of autonomy. From the moment she's born, every choice about her future is dictated by powerful men who view her not as a person, but as a pawn. She is betrothed, while still a toddler, to her uncle, Leopold III, Holy Roman Emperor. Across Europe, the engagement is heralded as a diplomatic victory. No one pauses to consider the child at the center of it all. She is groomed for this fate with the finest education a girl of her status could receive: languages, music, dance, painting. But these skills are not for her enrichment. They're adornments, meant only to make her a more desirable bride for the man who is both her uncle and her future husband. The wedding takes place in 1666. Margaret Theresa is just 15 years old. Leopold is 26, old enough to be her father. And more disturbingly, he's her uncle, her father's own brother. Their union is marked by extravagant ceremonies and public celebration. But for Margaret Theresa, it signals the end of what little remained of her youth. The physical reality of their marriage is something court records only allude to in carefully chosen language. Despite her fragile health and tender age, she's expected to bear children immediately. The future of the Habsburg dynasty rests on her ability to produce healthy heirs. She becomes pregnant several times, but each outcome is heartbreakingly bleak. Her first daughter survives only a few months. Her second pregnancy ends in miscarriage. Eventually, she gives birth to a son who lives beyond infancy, a moment of immense relief within the court. But that relief quickly fades when it becomes clear he suffers from the full range of inherited Habsburg defects. Each pregnancy weakens Margaret Theresa further. Years of inbreeding layered atop the physical toll of repeated childbirth ravage her health. Modern medicine would likely diagnose her with severe anemia, respiratory issues, and possibly epilepsy. Contemporary physicians meticulously recorded her deterioration, her slurred speech, frequent seizures, and inability to keep food down. Yet they never acknowledged the underlying cause, the centuries of genetic damage running through her veins. Margaret Theresa dies in 1673, just 6 years after her wedding, at only 21 years old. Official documents cite fever as the cause, but the truth is more devastating. Her body simply collapsed under the compounded weight of hereditary illness and relentless pregnancies. Her death is widely mourned across the empire, but not for her suffering. Courtiers and diplomats grieve not the young woman lost, but the political asset she represented, a vessel for heirs to a bloodline already fatally compromised. Our story now shifts to the dazzling splendor of Versailles. Behind its grand facades and carefully choreographed court rituals, another Habsburg princess battles the hidden costs of her lineage. Anna of Austria, born in 1601, is the daughter of Philip III of Spain and Margaret of Austria. Yet another uncle-niece match deemed not only acceptable, but advantageous among Europe's ruling elite. Anna's early years in Madrid follow a familiar script. Her development is slow, mirroring the struggles of other Habsburg children. Her protruding jaw makes eating and speaking difficult, and she exhibits clear signs of what modern medicine would identify as chronic anxiety and deep depression, emotional burdens that shape her daily existence. At 14, she is married off to Louis VIII of France in 1615, a union designed to cement peace between two rival powers that had spent decades at war. Diplomats celebrate the marriage as a strategic triumph. No one pauses to consider the personal toll on Anna, a young girl uprooted from her home, thrust into a foreign culture, forced to adapt to an unfamiliar language, customs, and the immense weight of queenship in a strange land. The French court greets Anna with extravagant pageantry, but beneath the glittering surface, her new reality settles in quickly. Louis VIII is a distant, emotionally detached husband who shows little genuine interest in his young bride. He battles his own inner struggles. Modern historians suggest he likely suffered from severe depression and possibly homosexuality, conditions that in his era could neither be spoken of nor lived openly. Anna is caught between two crushing expectations. As Queen of France, she is duty-bound to produce male heirs to secure the throne. Yet, as a Habsburg, she carries hereditary defects that make successful pregnancies difficult and often tragic. Her early pregnancies end in miscarriage or the deaths of infants shortly after birth, each loss deepening her despair and heightening her anxiety. The court physicians, operating under the medical beliefs of their time, place the blame squarely on Anna. They subject her to brutal and degrading treatments, repeated bloodletting, forced purges, restrictive and bizarre diets, and invasive examinations, searching for supposed flaws in her feminine nature. None of them consider the obvious, that the problem lies not in Anna herself, but in the centuries of inbreeding embedded in her genetic inheritance. As the years pass without a surviving heir, Anna's isolation grows. Whispers spread through the palace corridors that she is cursed, that God disapproves of the Spanish marriage, that France needs a new queen. The pressure and humiliation become overwhelming. She develops what modern doctors would likely recognize as severe agoraphobia, retreating into her private rooms and avoiding public appearances for extended periods. Her relationship with Louis VIII deteriorates further. Each blames the other for their failure to produce heirs. Their lives diverge almost completely, intersecting only for ceremonial appearances. In her loneliness, Anna turns increasingly to faith, spending countless hours in prayer and immersing herself obsessively in Catholic rituals for comfort. Then, after 23 years of marriage, what many consider a miracle occurs. Anna gives birth to a healthy baby boy, the future Louis XIV, the Sun King. The entire kingdom erupts in celebration, proclaiming the birth as a sign of divine blessing. But for Anna, this moment of triumph brings new fears. She understands that her worth in the eyes of the court rests on her ability to produce heirs. And now the expectation is to do it again. 2 years later, she delivers a second son, Felipe, securing the royal succession and easing the relentless pressure. Yet the scars of her suffering remain. Years of emotional torment and physical strain cannot be undone. Anna continues to struggle with deep anxiety and depression, finding little joy even in her eventual success as a mother. In her later years, she battles worsening health, chronic digestive problems, breathing difficulties, and what court physicians vaguely describe as melancholy attacks that leave her bedridden for long stretches. Modern analysis of her symptoms suggests she endured the same anxiety disorders and depressive tendencies that haunted many members of the Habsburg dynasty, amplified by the trauma of her early marriage. Anna dies in 1666, having outlived her husband and witnessed her son ascend as one of Europe's most powerful rulers. Yet her true legacy isn't the dynastic triumphs recorded in history books. It's the immense personal cost she bore, a reminder of a system that treated women as vessels for dynastic ambition while ignoring the devastating genetic consequences of centuries of inbreeding. And as we move forward in time, we encounter another familiar name, Marie Antoinette. While she is most often remembered for her role in the French Revolution, her story is also intertwined with the Habsburg tradition of intermarriage and the physical and psychological burdens it carried. Marie Antoinette was born in 1755, the daughter of Empress Margaret Theresa of Austria and Francis I, Holy Roman Emperor. Though her parents' marriage wasn't as close-knit as some infamous Habsburg pairings, she still carried the genetic imprint of centuries of intermarriage within the dynasty. In 1770, at just 14, Marie Antoinette arrived in France as the young bride of the future Louis XVI. She brought with her not only the hopes of an Austrian-French alliance, but also the hidden burden of her family's genetic legacy. Her iconic portraits by artists such as Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun portray a radiant young queen, but they also subtly capture the familiar Habsburg features, a slightly pronounced lower lip, the distinctive jawline that had grown more defined with each successive generation of inbreeding. Her true struggles, however, were far less visible. Like many Habsburg descendants, Marie Antoinette suffered from what court physicians vaguely described as feminine difficulties. In reality, she endured severe menstrual problems, frequent miscarriages, and symptoms that modern medicine would recognize as hormonal imbalances, likely linked to hereditary factors. Her marriage to Louis XVI was troubled from the start, but not for the salacious reasons whispered at court. Both young royals bore the weight of their lineage. Louis displayed signs of developmental delays and pronounced social awkwardness, making intimacy challenging. Marie Antoinette, meanwhile, battled the deep-seated anxiety and depression that had haunted generations of Habsburg women. The expectation to produce an heir was relentless. For 7 years, their marriage remained unconsummated, sparking vicious gossip and public speculation. Physicians examined Marie Antoinette repeatedly, searching for anatomical explanations for the couple's failure to conceive. What they could not comprehend was that both partners were grappling with a mix of psychological and possibly physical challenges rooted in their shared hereditary background. When Marie Antoinette finally became pregnant, her difficulties persisted. Her first pregnancy was overshadowed by intense morning sickness, panic episodes, and what today would likely be diagnosed as prenatal depression. Her daughter, Margaret Theresa, was born healthy, a moment of joy, but subsequent pregnancies ended in miscarriages and infant deaths, leaving her emotionally devastated. The true tragedy of Marie Antoinette's story lies in how her inherited vulnerabilities collided with the political storm of the French Revolution. Her anxiety, depression, and likely hormonal imbalances made it extraordinarily difficult to navigate the escalating crisis. Traits that might have been manageable in a stable environment, impulsiveness, emotional swings, and erratic decision-making, became disastrous as France spiraled into upheaval. Contemporaries at court noted her increasingly unpredictable behavior. She would oscillate between bursts of manic energy and periods of crushing melancholy, struggling to maintain the level-headed political judgment that the times demanded. Historians continue to debate whether these mood fluctuations were entirely circumstantial or whether they reflected deeper psychiatric tendencies common among Habsburg descendants. The infamous phrase, "let them eat cake," almost certainly a fabrication, became a symbol of how her critics weaponized her perceived emotional instability to portray her as indifferent and cruel. In reality, her tragedy was the opposite. She was emotionally overwhelmed by the suffering surrounding her and lacked the psychological tools to manage it. During her imprisonment and trial, Marie Antoinette displayed moments of striking bravery, but also signs of dissociation, a pattern seen in other Habsburg women under severe stress. Guards noted episodes of confusion, difficulty concentrating during interrogations, and periods when she would withdraw inward, seemingly detached from the chaos around her. Marie Antoinette's execution in 1793 marked more than the end of a queen's life. It signaled the fading of a genetic line that had shaped the course of European history for centuries. In her final moments, she displayed the same poise that had always been her most admirable quality, but also the quiet resignation of someone who had endured immense suffering without ever fully understanding its roots. To truly grasp the magnitude of the Habsburg genetic tragedy, we must look beyond individual lives to entire generations systematically undone by dynastic inbreeding. Nowhere is this more striking than in the stories of the Spanish infantas of the late 17th and early 18th centuries, daughters and granddaughters of Charles II of Spain. Their lives represent perhaps the most concentrated example of hereditary collapse in European royal history. Charles II himself was the ultimate product of 16 generations of Habsburg intermarriage. His inbreeding coefficient, the measure of how closely related his parents were, exceeded that of a child born to siblings. He was impotent, epileptic, and likely intellectually disabled. Yet his female relatives often suffered even more, for unlike Charles, they were expected to marry and produce heirs. Their lives became clinical illustrations of genetic degeneration, their suffering hidden behind royal walls. Maria Margherita, born in 1651, showed profound developmental delays from childhood. Palace records describe a girl who could not speak clearly until the age of 7, struggled to walk, and displayed behaviors modern medicine would likely recognize as autism spectrum disorder. Despite these challenges, she was still deemed marriageable. Because her blood was royal, her sister, Margaret Theresa, manifested a different set of inherited afflictions. She endured what physicians of the time called falling sickness, almost certainly epilepsy, along with severe breathing difficulties that left her winded after climbing even a few steps. Her jaw was so malformed she could consume only liquid foods, and her spine was so distorted she required constant physical support just to sit upright. These sisters, along with many of their cousins, grew up in Madrid's Alcazar Palace, a royal residence that had effectively transformed into a medical ward. Surgeons, priests, and physicians constantly attended to the royal children, each one exhibiting a different manifestation of the same genetic crisis. The palace archives from this era read less like royal chronicles and more like medical manuals. Epilepsy, cognitive impairments, skeletal deformities, immune deficiencies, and psychiatric disorders filled their pages. Despite their visible suffering, these young women were still expected to fulfill their dynastic duty, to marry and bear children. European courts exchanged detailed medical reports not out of compassion, but to evaluate their worth as breeding stock. Maria Margherita was eventually married off to her cousin, Leopold III, Holy Roman Emperor, the same man who had once wed Margaret Theresa. The union was disastrous. Her developmental disabilities made marital relations incomprehensible, while her physical ailments made consummation nearly impossible. The psychological toll of such arrangements was immense. These women grew up knowing that their entire value rested on their ability to produce heirs, even as their bodies made successful childbearing nearly unattainable. Many lived in constant fear of pregnancy, aware that each conception put their lives at risk and would likely result in severely afflicted offspring. Letters exchanged between royal women of the period lay bare the human cost in heartbreaking detail. Accounts of miscarriages, stillbirths, infants born so malformed they died within hours, and children who survived only days or weeks. Beneath the formal language lies raw grief, fear, and resignation. Many of these women developed what we would now diagnose as severe anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress. Ashamed of their appearances and perceived failures, they withdrew from public life, living in isolation. Lacking any understanding of genetic science, they blamed themselves or believed they were cursed by God. This self-reproach added yet another layer of suffering to lives already marked by physical pain and emotional devastation. Today, genetic science explains what they could not. When close relatives reproduce, their children are far more likely to inherit 2 copies of harmful recessive genes. In genetically diverse populations, these defects are usually masked by healthy genes from unrelated parents. But in dynasties like the Habsburg, where cousins married cousins for generation after generation, these harmful genes accumulated and compounded. With each successive generation, the probability of genetic disorders increased, affecting not just physical appearance but fertility, immunity, and mental health. One of the clearest physical markers of this genetic legacy is the so-called Habsburg jaw, mandibular prognathism. Over time, this trait became more pronounced until some members of the dynasty could no longer fully close their mouths or chew solid food. But that was only the visible part of a much larger and more devastating biological collapse. Modern genetic research has confirmed what history only hinted at. Descendants of the Habsburg dynasty exhibited elevated rates of epilepsy, intellectual disabilities, anxiety disorders, depression, and weakened immune systems. Many of the mysterious illnesses that tormented royal women were almost certainly autoimmune conditions triggered by inherited genetic damage. Their widespread fertility problems also have a genetic explanation. Inbreeding heightens the chance of genetic incompatibilities that make conception more difficult and pregnancies far more dangerous. The tragic prevalence of miscarriages and infant deaths among Habsburg women wasn't simply the result of poor medical knowledge. It was the inevitable consequence of centuries of accumulated genetic harm. Perhaps most heartbreaking of all are the psychological struggles of figures like Joanna of Castile and Marie Antoinette. Their emotional instability wasn't the product of inherent madness, as their contemporaries believed, but of genetic predispositions toward mental illness, intensified by the crushing expectations of their positions. Anxiety, depression, and mood disorders ran through their bloodlines. The relentless pressures of dynastic marriage and political responsibility pushed these vulnerabilities to their breaking point. What makes this story even more tragic is how the system persisted despite overwhelming evidence of its damage. Royal courts kept meticulous records detailing the declining health of their bloodlines. Physicians wrote exhaustive reports on the physical deformities and mental illnesses affecting royal children. But instead of serving as warnings, these records were treated as curiosities, sidelined in favor of political alliances. The Catholic Church, which could have intervened by denying dispensations for close relative marriages, did the opposite. It routinely granted exceptions, framing royal bloodlines as divinely chosen and their purity as more important than preventing human suffering. Even some of the women themselves, raised to see their lineage as superior, actively sought marriages within their own families, unaware that they were participating in the slow destruction of their own genetic legacy. Generation after generation, royal women hoped that their children would escape the family curse, that this time things might be different. They endured pregnancy after pregnancy, miscarriage after miscarriage, clinging to the fragile belief that the next child would be healthy. The dynasty's genetic experiment reached its tragic finale with Charles II of Spain. His inbreeding coefficient was so extreme that he was effectively more inbred than the offspring of a brother-sister union. Impotent, epileptic, and likely intellectually disabled, Charles was the culmination of 200 years of royal cousin marriages. His death in 1700 without heirs ended the Spanish Habsburg line and sparked the War of Spanish Succession. It also forced Europe's monarchies to confront an unavoidable truth: their inbreeding practices were unsustainable. Though cousin marriages continued among European royals, they gradually became less close as courts began to understand the biological risks. The women whose lives we've traced were victims of a system that valued politics over people, bloodline over well-being. They suffered and died not through divine punishment or personal failings, but because their ancestors made deliberate choices, prioritizing short-term power over long-term health. Their legacy is not only the sorrow recorded in royal archives, but the scientific knowledge that emerged from their suffering. The Habsburg dynasty's genetic collapse gave rise to key insights in modern genetics. Their pain, meticulously documented in court records and medical texts, helped shape our understanding of recessive genes, genetic diversity, and hereditary diseases. Their suffering cannot be justified, but it was not entirely in vain. And though royal inbreeding on this scale is a thing of the past, its echoes remain. In some isolated communities around the world, cousin marriage is still practiced, sometimes leading to similar genetic consequences. The same tension persists between preserving cultural traditions and protecting genetic health. Ultimately, the story of the Habsburg women is about more than a single dynasty. It's a reminder of what happens when human beings are treated not as individuals with dignity and agency, but as tools for political ambition. For centuries, these women were reduced to their reproductive function, their worth measured only by their ability to bear heirs. That dehumanization is not confined to the past. It echoes through history and in many places continues today. As we conclude these tragic stories, we face a difficult truth: their suffering built the foundation of modern genetic science. The Habsburg experiment, horrific as it was for those who lived through it, gave researchers critical data about heredity, genetic recessiveness, and the importance of genetic diversity. It doesn't make their pain acceptable, but it ensures that their suffering was not meaningless. The knowledge gained from studying the Habsburg legacy has helped modern science understand genetics in ways that prevent similar tragedies today. But behind the scientific breakthroughs were real lives: Maria Anna of Austria, Joanna of Castile, Margaret Theresa of Spain, Anna of Austria, Marie Antoinette, and the forgotten Spanish infantas. These were not merely historical curiosities or textbook examples of genetic collapse. They were daughters, wives, mothers, human beings who lived, suffered, and deserved better than the cruel fate that politics and heredity conspired to give them. Their stories remind us why human well-being must always outweigh political ambition, why individual dignity should never be sacrificed for ideology, and how even the most powerful institutions can inflict unimaginable harm when they lose sight of basic humanity. Return for a moment to that opening image. Waking up to realize that every hardship in your life was determined before you were born. shaped by ancestors who prized bloodline purity above human welfare. For the women of the Habsburg dynasty, this wasn't a hypothetical. It was their daily reality. Their physical pain, emotional torment, reproductive struggles, and isolation all stemmed from the same poisoned genetic inheritance, the result of centuries of deliberate choices made in the name of power. And yet, within this tragedy, there is something profoundly human. Despite the weight of their circumstances, many found ways to assert their personhood. Maria Anna turned to scholarship, finding intellectual liberation in a body that confined her. Joanna, even in her madness, held fast to love. Margaret Theresa endured her suffering with quiet dignity. Anna sought solace in her faith. Marie Antoinette faced death with courage few could muster. Their stories reveal a universal truth. Even in the darkest conditions, the human spirit struggles to be seen, to be heard, to be remembered, and they challenge us to learn from their suffering, to ensure that our political, social, or cultural ambitions never again demand the systematic destruction of human lives. The curse of bloodline purity has faded, at least in its most extreme forms. But the memory of these women endures. Their lives are a testament to the devastating cost of placing ideology above compassion, tradition above humanity, and power above love. Their legacy is both tragic and redemptive. Tragic because their suffering was entirely avoidable. Redemptive because their experiences gave rise to scientific understanding that has saved countless lives since. They paid the ultimate price so future generations could learn the lesson their ancestors refused to face, that human worth cannot be measured by lineage, and that true nobility lies not in blood but in shared humanity. Though their voices were silenced by time and death, they still echo through history with a message that is as simple as it is profound. Remember us. Not for our titles or the politics that shaped our lives, but as human beings who deserved better than the fate that genetics and power imposed on us. Remember us, and learn so that others may never endure the same curse.